everybody. My mother and I are fucking late, so I apologize. We are 5 minutes late. We had childcare duty, if you will. Say hi, Mom. It's your podcast.
Hi.
She doesn't understand. She needs to get closer to the mic. Technical difficulties. So my mother is setting up to move. We're getting ready to move. Okay, so we're doing the podcast here from my house, and tonight we're going to be talking about autism, right?
Correct.
Okay, so tell me about autism because I feel like a lot has changed as far as perspective, and I say that very respectfully to anybody who has a loved one with autism, or maybe you have autism yourself. Because I think growing up, I had this image that autism meant that you kind of just said what was on your mind, you couldn't focus, you were just saying things that didn't really make sense to some people, right? But now that's not the case. Like some people think Steve Jobs had some autism, Elon Musk is on the spectrum to some extent, and that the saying things that people may not understand is just the brilliance coming out. But doctor it up for me, sauce it up for me.
Sometimes you say, don't doctor it up. All right. So I think we're getting better and better at diagnosing the different styles of learning and communicating. So I think that's what you're asking. Hey, what you're saying, when I was young and growing up, I thought it was just this one thing. But now we're more sophisticated and there's different levels of autism. So a large percentage actually of people with ASD, autism spectrum disorder, actually are nonverbal.
Did you watch that video I posted this morning
No,
about the kid with autism? He did a TED talk.
no.
He said he doesn't want it to be. He said that there's people looking for a cure, and he said he doesn't like that because that would mean he has a disease. He said that there's no such thing as having a disorder. He says it's a way of life, and you kind of just have to learn how to adapt. What do you think about that?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. He's a great, I will listen to that. I think, learning to adapt and adjust, that's a very positive attitude. But back to what I was saying. So there's different classifications. I guess probably it started with the cancer cases where they staged things. Back in the day, it was you had cancer. Then it was you have stage one, you have stage two,
You have a
3 and
different
4.
type.
You have a different type.
Yeah.
And psychiatry and psychology followed suit.
Okay.
So think of it that way. So now, as I said, a large function of kids and young people with ASD that are diagnosed nonverbal. But what most people think about when they're talking about ASD are what fascinates me and what I love to work with, which are the higher functioning people on the spectrum. But here's my favorite quote about ASD: everybody has a little bit.
I believe that.
Everybody has a little bit of it. Everybody has some quirk. But I wanted to do this podcast really for the parents who have trouble getting an accurate diagnosis. So our last podcast, we talked a lot about ADD and ADHD. And I was trying to explain in my factoring it up that there's comorbids. There's disorders that run together. A large percentage of young people, kids that have ADHD, also have ASD, also have the autism spectrum disorder. But sometimes parents, they go through this tedious evaluation process, find out the kid has ADHD, it's still not making sense what's going on, and they don't always know to ask for a great and thorough autism evaluation. And so I wanted to get the word out. Don't stop there. If you think ADD or ADHD is not the complete diagnosis, then don't stop and demand a good evaluation. And when I say demand, you can start with the school district. Every school has a duty to evaluate the kids. Sometimes parents have to be persistent. Sometimes the school might say, but we already came up with this diagnosis, and the parent has to be a little forceful and say, we don't think that covers it all. We want to go further and see if, as we've come to say in our vernacular, the child is on the spectrum, having a spectrum disorder.
So I guess that kind of goes back to my first question because I'm sure everything you just said is accurate. As a matter of fact, I would say I'm positive everything you just said is accurate. But that's one question that I have, and again, respect to anybody who has autism or has a loved one with autism. And you will hear me say this a lot when I do these interviews with my mom, and it's no disrespect to anything. It's just more out of curiosity. Like you said, you even talked about cancer and things like that. Who has the right to say that suddenly autism and ADD may go hand in hand and you might not realize? Because like I said, I remember being in the office and I would see you treating kids with autism, and sometimes it was more difficult and you had to get their attention and things like that. And that's the perspective that I had, and I think a lot of people had. But then now you're saying ADD, ADHD can kind of they can kind of bleed, and autism can bleed into one another. Like who decided that, and when did that become a thing? Like 10 years ago, 8 years ago, 15 years ago?
I'd say in the last 10 or 15 years, who decides it is people much smarter than myself who do a lot of statistical analysis and studies, researchers. I think, and we touched on this before, I think implicit in what you're asking me is, do we really need all those labels? But labels are not always a bad thing.
Mhm.
Labels are not bad. Labels can pave the way for funding for the school, so kids can be labeled as exceptional and get some benefit from the school. There's all kinds of funding sources for kids with that are on the spectrum. So I think it's what you do with the label. So we could all put a label on everybody if we wanted to, right?
Mhm.
But this is something that I think we're better off if we think that there isn't one way to learn and there isn't one way to communicate. So let's go back to what autism really is. It's a neurodevelopmental delay. It's about not being
Delay,
delay,
not a disorder, not a disease.
not a disorder,
Delay.
not a disease.
Perfect. I think that's important. Not a disorder, not a disease, a delay.
So that let's go to the high functioning end, so that you can have a high level of intelligence, but be delayed. Where would you be delayed? On communication, on social skills, and on something we call executive function. What's executive function? You work in the hotel management field, right? What's an executive do?
No executive oversees everything.
And they organize and they plan.
Right.
They have good time management.
Mhm.
That's a part of the impairment with these delays. You'll often see a young person on the spectrum who has a procrastination problem, who gets overwhelmed. One way I know, bingo, they have one of these delays is on long term assignments. So when you get a little older in school, the assignment's not due the next day. It might be due over 3, 4 weeks. You have to plan. That's often a disaster with a kid with a neurodevelopmental delay. And I'm glad you picked up on that word delay. That can put you at a social disadvantage if you're delayed, right? Because then you might not be quote unquote on age appropriate behavior, age level. So one of the things we see is just an interesting finding. Kids with these delays relate well to younger kids and older kids. Where you see the hardest hit impairment in kids of their own age. That's where they really have this social impairment. So they'll do well with younger kids. They'll do well with older people who are more patient and understanding. So go back to it's a neurodevelopmental delay and a communication problem and a social problem. And I think why I like it so much is it pushes my brain all the time to say, what is that person really trying to communicate? We live in a time where ABC has a show called The Good Doctor. And just like you were saying, if you asked me 10 years ago, would there ever be a show where a doctor has autism? I'd say you're insane. That's never happening. So look how far we came. I think that it's one of the top rated shows now on ABC.
Mhm.
And while he's a
Mhm.
fine actor, I think sometimes it's a little bit overdone, but they're doing that for the purpose to show just what I'm saying, that you can be so brilliant cognitively, but then impaired or delayed in some of the other issues. And I think that show is great in showing, hey, this guy figures out things that none of the doctors can figure out, but he doesn't know how to tell his girlfriend that he loves her. So they do a nice job of explaining that kind of disconnect. And again, that's a message I want to get out. If you see some things, I'd like to give some red flags, if you will, for parents to look at. If you see some delays, some things like I'm saying, a schism, a gap. Hey, there's high level of intelligence, but impairment in organization, impairment in that executive functioning part of the brain, impairment in social relationships and communication, then you start to think about maybe a diagnosis of ASD. They also have a rigidity. A lot of people on the spectrum have a rigidity. They One of the questions I ask when I'm not sure and I'm doing an evaluation is what foods did they like when they were young. Now listen, you have 4 kids. Kids don't really like a variety of foods.
Yeah.
Agree,
No, I
right?
agree, yeah.
But it's so rigid. So when your
Well, I heard
kids
the texture is one thing. A kid with autism, they won't like ground beef or maybe rice or the texture or something.
and kids with ADD, one question, our family member who passed away, Greg, definitely was somewhat on the spectrum. And when he was young, he'd throw a conniption if a label touched him. So, so his mom had to cut all the labels out of his clothes because he couldn't stand the texture, the feel. Very sensitive to environmental stimuli, overreacting at
But
times.
Aunt Hen said that he would even, if he got very upset when he was a toddler, he would start banging his head on the crib. And
Nice, he did. He's talking about my nephew who passed away's mom and how, yeah, he was a headbanger. What's that tell you? He couldn't
he's
communicate
frustrated.
exactly.
Yeah.
And what I say, neurodevelopmental delay. My nephew who passed away was reading at 2.5 years old, incredibly mentally advanced, but socially and emotionally very behind. So when he was frustrated, he couldn't say, "Put that label, I don't like it." What did he do? He did. He banged his head.
Well, I want to stay on that real quick because, like I said, I told you I know a young man who, excuse me, it's allergies, it's not COVID, I promise. He would he worked a full time job, had his driver's license. He would tell you that he was on the spectrum of autism, and he actually was very happy to explain that there was opposite ends of the spectrum, which was I thought was cool because I didn't know. Ultimately, he went on to graduate from Temple, served honorably in the United States military, honorable discharge from the military, and now he's a sheriff's deputy. He lives a full time. He served his country his entire life. He served his community. He's on the autism spectrum. So I think, and I'm just speaking for you, and you can speak to it. I think it's important for people to remember, parents in particular, or guardians, aunts, and uncles, who's ever a caretaker involved in the child's life, that this is just another delay and nothing is over. You can find a way to navigate it, perhaps, depending upon the severity or the level, if you will. But, and then I've also heard that people think, and don't quote me here, Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, all these very successful innovators, people who have designed things, created things, programs, cars, and things like that. I've heard that Elon Musk has a tendency to get very upset in meetings, but people who understand speak to it saying he's not upset because he's angry. His brain is just so big and functioning at a level that he can't figure out how to tell other smart people what he's thinking, and that he gets frustrated in that way.
There goes the communication problem,
Yeah.
right? At the light. So who's the smartest person? If you live in the universe, who comes to mind as the smartest person? Albert Einstein.
Yes.
Do you not think he had some ASD?
They said he didn't speak for a while, right? When he was a kid.
Exactly. So there we go. The high intelligence, and then the disconnect with some other things. But I think besides wanting to do the podcast to have parents follow their instinct, follow their gut, follow through on evaluations, I also wanted to say part of why I like working with the autism population for me personally, it forces you to look at your prejudice. We're a prejudiced society when it comes to kids. We want kids to look a certain way, to not be quirky, to fit a certain norm. And so it pushes me to say, and to say to the parents, hey, there's lots of ways to communicate. There's lots of ways to say things. It doesn't have to be all one way. And what you're talking about with these innovators is, of course, kids on the spectrum on that high functioning end often think outside the box. They don't
Well,
think
of
like
course,
they don't think like other people. They think outside the box, which is a wonderful quality. But I think for a lot of parents, it's a difficult conflict because they want them to be like all the other kids. So, what's that mean? I'm really talking about the younger years in elementary school. Who's popular in elementary school? They all look a certain way, they act a certain way, they have a certain athletic ability. That's not going to be the kid with on the spectrum,
right.
right? They're going to be a little different. So the parent sees this social, what would you call it, being ostracized socially, and their response to that is to make the kid fit in. Bad strategy, not the right strategy. I always say it's okay if they just have one friend. They don't need 20 friends,
Yeah.
but they need a friend who maybe also is on the spectrum, can think outside the box, can have some compassion. Autism will push you, dealing with that population, being a parent, it will push you to think about your own biases. and what do you really want for your child. And for some parents, I say when they get that diagnosis, you're going to enter a phase of some mourning. Not that it isn't wonderful to parent a child on the spectrum, but some mourning that it isn't going to be exactly like you thought parenting was going to be. Does that make sense?
That
So
makes sense.
we help them go through my favorite word, acceptance. And that's what you're saying is that once those people who are successful accept it, this part might be a little more difficult for me, but it's not going to stop me. So we say, yes, you might have some extra challenges, but in no way does that have to limit what you're going to do in life.
I have a question. I asked this to Monica, and I told her we never really got around to talking about it, or me being able to ask her on the podcast. I I want to know, or I'm curious, how does somebody in your field or somebody in Monica's, or are you even able to say, oh yeah, he's the next Elon Musk, or oh yeah, he's the next Steve Jobs, or whoever. Like, do you see it? Do you think it might be there, or are these innovators just anomaly? Not I can't say it. Anomalies.
Oh, no, I think that's a great question. And now, because I've been 40 years in practice and have longevity, I see the kids that I predicted would do great things. And guess what? They did great things, usually a little bit with the ADHD or ASD diagnosis. And they ran that football down the field and did wonderful things. A lot, now that you mention it, a lot were in the computer science fields, innovative, groundbreaking fields, and they did great work. They're not going to be uh, in traditional jobs. They were jobs where they had a lot of, like you said, room for growth and
Hmm.
and ability to be innovators. So I'm not saying I'm clairvoyant, but I think I have a good feel after all these years of who's going to make it and who's going to be successful in life. But a lot of it was, like I said, they accepted who they were. They didn't try to compete socially with some of the other more men that I've seen with autism, with some of the other young men, and they just carved out a niche for themselves. They had friends that were accepting of their delays, friends that were really true friends, and weren't trying to put these kids in the same box as everyone else. So yeah, I'm not saying we predict with 100% accuracy, but yes, we can tell who's going to do well, who's going to do well with it.
I have to keep waving her back to the mic
I think I'm
because she
having a
is going.
little ADT tonight.
So I'm gonna circle back to parents, and parents, don't kill me for this one. How many times in your 40 years of practicing have you yourself, or you and somebody else who was doing the testing or whatever, said, uh, we think or your child does have autism, and they say, yeah, fuck you both, you're both crazy, my kid doesn't have autism, and they leave themselves in denial, perhaps to a fault, or they don't address it because they refuse to address it?
And that's across the board in all psychological and psychiatric disorders across the board. The place it happens the most is not actually with autism, although there's some of that. I'll get to it. But the number one place it happens the most? Drugs and alcohol. My kid's not addicted. You're crazy. That's the number one resistance, especially if it's an opiate addiction. That's if you're asking me
How
what
can they not
parents,
see it? The
they're
skin, the dozing off, the money disappearing, the just the behavior. How can they not see it?
how did Dylan Klebold, who massacred the kids at Columbine, not see it? How did parents? How did they not see it? Go back and look at the worst things kids did. He was doing things right in his
In his
basement,
shed, I
wasn't he? In
heard.
his
In
shed.
his shed, he had
So
diagrams. I heard. Yeah.
denial is blinding. The parents don't want to accept it, and let's be honest, the whole mental health system is not great to get help with,
It's true.
right? So they get frustrated and give up sometimes. But that's the number one place I see it is with drugs and alcohol and the parents denying that. With the autism, the ADD and ADHD, there is a bias, and we were talking about it last time. It's sometimes a cultural bias, and it is frustrating when you're the doc given the diagnosis because the parents say, You're just putting a label for bad behavior.
Mhm.
It's just bad behavior.
There's only one label that I don't agree with. Uh, oppositional defiance disorder.
OTD, yes.
That just sounds like BS. That one sounds like just somebody straight being defiant. I and you and I have over the years have butt heads and over certain things, and I obviously am much more open minded and smarter. Hopefully, at this point, that one sounds like BS. Please list the bullet point, the factors, if you will. What could be
With
part of the
oppositional
diagnosis?
defiance.
Yeah.
Well, they're rule breakers and
Okay.
rule challengers. You're going to
Okay.
say that's all you
Yeah,
can
exactly. So you're just a bad kid.
say.
I heard you can get an
Well,
IEP for that these days.
yes, you can get an IEP for that. But remember, go back to what I said about comorbid. So they tend to run together with ADD and ADHD and other disorders, not so much oppositional defiant on its own.
Marla's back. If someone with autism has if someone with autism has trouble with communication, how can we learn to communicate differently to help them? Does how we react or interact with them help or not?
Oh, I love that question. And that's true for everybody's communication style. That's why we're going to think about doing some future podcasts on how people communicate in general, not just if they have ASD. Thing with whether it's ADD, ADHD, or ASD, number one thing is to validate their feelings when they first speak. I try always to validate their feelings because kids on the spectrum, I remember I said there's some rigidity. So they might make very strong statements and you have to validate, not oppose.
Jade, go back upstairs and go to bed. Sorry, everybody.
And then,
Now, Jade.
and now,
Jade, go back upstairs and go to bed.
that's my
I
little
just heard her creep
granddaughter.
down. Jade,
That's
now.
parenting in action now, but she's excited because her mom's.
Yeah, she's excited because she saw mom before she went to bed. So I'm sorry to cut you off.
Yeah,
As you were.
so she was just excited to see me. So I think that the validation's important and then pushing your brain. Remember what I said? I like it because it makes you push your brain to say, what are they really saying? What are they really trying to say? For example, here's a finding in young girls as they reach puberty that have ASD. They tend to like to copy. So sometimes I would bring your daughter to my office. Every family member's always been in my office in the waiting room.
True.
And if you, it's true. And sometimes I brought Alexis, Ryan's oldest, my son's oldest daughter, my oldest granddaughter. And I didn't realize at first, this was years ago. And the young girls with autism would see Alexis in the waiting room. And they start in the middle of a session to say something like this: Hey, Doc, when you take Alexis to Starbucks, what drink does she have? So back to Marla's question. If I said that has nothing to do with the topic we're talking about, that wouldn't be a good approach. I have to push my brain to say, what's she trying to say? So my granddaughter is very social. She has a lot of friends. What those young girls were saying was, hey, maybe if I copy something like what she has at Starbucks, it'll bring me what? It'll bring me
Attention.
attention,
Attention.
friends, people. I'll be like everybody else.
Right.
I'll pick the drink. And so I started to put the pieces together. Hey, why they keep asking me, what music does my granddaughter like? What does she like when she goes to Taco Bell or Chipotle? And then I started to dig and do some research and see that copying, imitation is a big form of uh, of what young girls, adolescent girls, as they reach puberty, try to do. And it's really a pretty good strategy, isn't it?
But I have a weird question now, and this is perhaps my brain, if you will, thinking into things a little bit too much. You're saying that patterns can be a thing, that they can try to repeat things. So, from a psychological standpoint, does behavior like that go hand in hand when somebody with autism figures out the rhythm in a mathematical equation or a video game and suddenly they get better at it, they're quicker at it and quicker at it, and they anticipate everything because they've learned the pattern and they've taken it on. Does that
That
make sense?
that's a really smart question because yes, they're patterned because rigid, limited interest, not as interested in everything as everybody else. They have their same interests, the same conversations, and sometimes I don't know if we're supposed to use this term anymore. They have that idiot savant syndrome where
Hmm.
they show it on
Monica
that
told me it
show,
all the time. Yeah,
right? A
yeah,
savant
yeah.
where they can do things over and over and over.
Right.
But again, back to Marla's point about how do you communicate, you have to validate that that's interesting to them, right? That is the same uh, uh, thing that as making them feel good, not putting them down. But here's now we're on that topic. They also are not good as a group at reading social cues.
Oh yeah,
So people
yeah.
will come and tell me stories and they'll say, well, I love my friend that has autism, but they're telling me things at 10 o'clock at night that I have no interest in. Very obscure things, maybe about politicians or history or giving a lesson, but I'm not interested in it. Help, what should I do? Because I don't want to offend them. And so, there's a polite way of saying, hey, we hold that conversation till later, or being direct and saying, look at my face. Can you see that you're losing me? I'm not as interested right now. Let's pick it up later. So there are some challenges in
Of
that, but I
course. Yeah.
think always keeping the communication positive and pushing your brain to say, what are they really trying? Like, so when I'm in a session with somebody on the spectrum, ADD, I'm always pushing my brain to say, what are they really trying to say? Because of that developmental delay, they're not saying it maybe as somebody at the same age as them. There's a rule of thumb in ADD that you take a third of their age off. You know what that means? So if you're working with somebody who's 30 and they have ADD or ADHD, you take 10 years off and say, emotionally, socially, I'm working with somebody who's 20 years old. So I try to do that. Say, well, where would they be if they were 20? How would they say that?
Except
What
they're
would they
smarter
say?
than you.
Extremely.
They're smarter than you. They're just delayed in saying it.
Right.
They're smarter than
Yeah, they are. I mean, they're some of the IQs are through the roof. But I go back to
you. They pick up on your patterns by the fifth
oh
session,
yeah,
and you
probably.
piss them off because they're tired of. They think that you have them figured out, but instead they have you figured out because you're asking the same questions in the same order at the same time.
Sometimes, I
Sorry, this
mean,
is what I do to
they're
pick on my mom.
if you're asking, as a group, are they great? Let's turn that question around. What's their frustration level like? What's their irritation level like? Not great. So here's the typical thing that will happen. We have telesession medicine now, telepsychiatry, kids you see after school. So often they'll say to me, I'm tired, I don't want to speak. I don't want to do this session, I'm tired. I'm exhausted. But it's usually when you got into what? Some kind of hot topic. So yeah, everybody's a little tired after school, but their typical lament will be, I don't want to talk about it. It's something that I want the parents to hear. And it will continue throughout, into young adulthood. I don't want to talk about it. The boy didn't ask you to the prom. You didn't get the job you wanted. The interview didn't go well. I don't want to talk about it. Who's that like? That's like somebody younger says that, right? But it's hard for them and difficult for them sometimes to express difficult emotions. And the parents have to be aware of this and work with it and not let them avoid.
But do you
So,
ever think that? Sorry to cut you off. Do you ever think that that is just not so much, not so much the age, not so much somebody being a child, not so much autism, but I always say this, I don't think that we as humans give children, younger people, enough credit for how smart they are. And is the fatigue mental because their brains are working so fast and so hard, but that by 6 p.m. when they have to go see Dr. Joe and they just don't want to do it because their thoughts, which may have been positive or curiosity, were running all day. And that's what it is. It has nothing to do with being younger or not wanting to do it. It's just because they're so smart and mentally exhausted by 6 p.m. themselves. Because I know that my thoughts can wear me down. I'm sure you feel the same. I'm sure we all feel
absolutely.
the same. Your thoughts can wear you down.
But that you have to take that person by person and age appropriate. So if they're 7 or 8, I don't like to have sessions at 6 o'clock with 7, 8, 9 year olds because absolutely right. There's a fatigue factor. Now let's take if they're 14. They're 14 and it's 6 o'clock. Well, now we have another story because 14
They
puts
got their
them,
second wind.
and it puts them 2 years from what? From driving. And what
Yes.
happens when you drive? You got to help pay for the car insurance. You have to have a job. You can't say that you're fatigued at 6 o'clock anymore.
Mhm.
You have to find a different coping mechanism. So, yeah, I'm very flexible. If it's a younger child, I don't want to torture them. But as we get older, right, we have to have a fuller day and adjust and adapt. But I think my point was more about difficult topics. For all of us, we want to avoid talking about difficult topics, but because of the, if you want to, for lack of a better word, say an immaturity factor in autism spectrum, then it becomes even harder to get it out. And that again, I hope everybody watches a clip from that show, The Good Doctor. That's one of the things they stress. He gets quote unquote all jammed up and can't get those feelings out.
Right.
One of my favorite episodes in that show was when he lost a patient. And this is the most brilliant doctor cognitively, and now he lost a patient. A mistake was made, and he didn't. He just shut down. That's a word we use in autism a lot. Hey, your kid just shut down and couldn't express it and couldn't get it out until somebody, his mentor, has a way. Back to Marla's question, has a way of telling him it's okay to feel that way. But here's the thing: people don't get those feelings, that the anxiety feelings, the feeling of despair, disappointment, they don't go away when you shut them down. They go to someplace no good. So that's the message I
They
try to
feel
get out.
defeated.
Yeah, and the feelings go to someplace no good. They might go to depression. They might go to not wanting to try. They might go to comfort eating, making bad choices, but they don't go away. So let's wake everybody up. They don't go away. There'd be no mental health problems if they just went away, right? If you could just say, "Oh, I feel disappointed, I feel hurt," bang, 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 boom, 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 the pain goes away, we wouldn't have any mental health issues. I want to get that message out, and for the parents to get the message to the young people, it goes somewhere else and never any place good. The best way is to get it out directly and express it. But I'm not going to lie to you, it's a challenge with kids on the spectrum to do that.
So we're talking a lot about autism. Obviously, that's the topic. We're talking a lot about the kids and innovators and adolescents. Now, let's talk about as we head into the next stage of the episode, what can the parent and or guardian do? And what's it like being an adult with autism? I think that's important also.
Oh, yeah. I was hoping you'd get, let's start with that first, with
Yeah.
what's it like to be a adult? What's the hardest part of this in the adult life? The social aspect of your life, because that's where you're going to feel it the most. So, socially at work, right? Because work is not just work. You know better than anybody.
Right.
What percentage of your workday are social relationships?
Well, I always say this. I always say that I've learned so much about myself and life from working. I've been fortunate enough to work in a hotel where there's not 8 people, there's 42 people on 3 different shifts, 6 different shifts, and you learn so much. But like you said, it's like the social interaction, it's in passing, it's in the cafeteria, it's if you're working side by side, do you have the same interest? And immediately when you said, I'm thinking like, are people with autism, they want to share their interests first, right?
They want to share.
And I mean that, and
100%.
I mean that in the most respectful way. They want to share their interests first.
Absolutely. And
Yes.
some people will say there's some narcissism in the disorder. It looks that way on the surface. Look at what we said tonight, right? We said that restricted interest, be interested in what I'm interested, not what someone else is interested in, shutting down, not sharing feelings. Absolutely. Their interests are in what they're interested first. But when we move into excuse me, with autism, here's something that happens. And as I said, I've definitely seen more men on the spectrum than women. So sometimes they bring the young woman that they're dating. And what do you think happens? The woman says, I was kind of understanding. And then it came to Valentine's Day. I didn't get any chocolate. I didn't get any flowers. I got a screwdriver. A screwdriver. He gave me a screwdriver because I He remembered that one time I
That's
couldn't
when
take
you're gonna
something,
say,
right? I
yeah,
couldn't take something
yeah,
apart. Is that love?
yes.
But it's the wrong partner if the partner doesn't see it as love.
Yeah, I was gonna say, but it's I think that's the type of gift that can be missed when somebody's like, "Oh, I remember that one time you didn't have this," and it's like, that screwdriver is gonna last a lot longer than flowers, so the heart was obviously in the right place,
Yeah.
in their mind.
I'm not a big flower
Yeah,
person because I have that OCD for cleanliness and
yeah.
they make a mess. But here's the deal, right? So what do you think I say to those young women?
Mm,
If that's what you're after, it's not going to work, is it? You have to be able, what I say earlier, to accept, adjust, and think outside the box and say maybe there's a bunch of different ways to express love. But we have that Hollywood romantic version of how a boyfriend is going to be, and that probably works against people who think a little differently and outside the box. So you see the impairment, right? Doesn't it? It's going to work against it.
yeah, it does. I agree.
They're not that locker room guy. And I don't mean to be crude. They're not talking about doing it with 100 women. It's hard enough to have an intimate relationship with one woman. And on a serious note, when you can get the young men to open up, that's a big issue. I don't fit in with those guys. I'm not necessarily not socially, physically adroit and adept. I don't understand how they think because my connection to the opposite sex is different. My connection is what you said through common interests, not everything physical, not everything visual.
Right.
So, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, that part of transitioning into the adult life is a little bit difficult because what I say, you have to, part of why I like working with it is that it forces you to think outside the box, right?
Yes.
And to look at people in a whole different way and not stereotype and not have one way. So for that girl who thinks there's one way to be a boyfriend, it's not going to be a good match. Is it?
Well, let's use that opportunity. Sorry, I keep moving my mic.
Now, did you ever get Monica a screwdriver? That's what I
I've gotten her a few
would.
things that she needed tool wise. Another question from Marla, as we're talking about relationships and what somebody's expectations may be. We can recognize someone with autism, but do they realize that they are different and do they wish they could change or do they want us to change? And Marla, thank you for viewing. I know that you're always tuning in, so I apologize for getting this question later, but that's the question. I guess do they realize?
Well,
I
if you
think they do, don't they?
yes and no, but if you put the pieces together of what I'm saying, they're kind of right. They're right. They're rigid. The interest in certain things. So I don't know that they necessarily see themselves as different. And if they
Well, do you
do,
tell somebody you have autism?
oh, I do
And
absolutely.
what's that response like?
It depends. I mean, it's not the first. I don't see them young anymore. So
Okay.
by the time I'm seeing them, they're maybe third, fourth grade. So they already know something's up. It's a relief to have somebody put the pieces together and explain it. Again, you have to work against stereotypes because some kids have heard that that's weird or not a good thing. I think we are changing that. I think that the awareness, there's so much awareness, so we're changing that. But sometimes it's more for the parents, really, Ryan, than the kids, that it can be heart wrenching. And that's why I said for some parents it's the morning. But I think for the young person, they don't think they're that different necessarily. They tend to think their way is right.
So when it comes to the parents, it's obviously not that they're mad at their kid. It's more short term and long term concern, I would imagine.
I think so.
Because we all have this expectation that our children are going to get to 18, 19, 20. We're going to send them off to college. They're going to join the army. They're going to go off. They're going to do great things, and we're going to leave them to it. Hopefully, we prepared them for the best and the worst. But you might have to prepare a little bit more if somebody has autism. So I guess it would be long term and short term fear,
Long term
concern,
and short term
concern, concern.
concern, and every parent wants to think the sky's the limit. There's no limit on possibilities. So they might mistake that label as a limitation. Something
Right,
would be
right.
limiting their future, but I don't think that's true. I don't think it was ever true necessarily, and certainly not true today. So I think that's part of it. It scares the parent a little bit. Like I said, because they don't want to feel that it would hold the child back from anything. But it wouldn't necessarily do that. The key is to work with the young person and say, okay, you have this. How can we make it work? And how can you have it be still successful? It doesn't have to define your life. No label, even a disease, a disorder, it shouldn't be the defining thing about your life. It should never be the defining thing, right?
So here's an perhaps an in-depth question. And when I say in-depth, not so much with my verbiage or anything like that, but how many sessions following the announcement of the diagnosis is mom and dad perhaps crying, overwhelmed? Suddenly the sessions have to become about them because you have to reel them back in and be like, listen, this is where we're at. And we can be upset about it for not, we can be upset. We can be upset about it. You're allowed to be upset about it. Nobody can tell you how to feel, but we need to get back on track and figure out how we're going to help them for the rest of their life, and we'll make it.
Well, that is a complex question. So let's go back to something I didn't say. Parenting is exhausting, and then
Yes.
parenting a special needs kid is twice as exhausting. And then we didn't even talk about some of the parents of special needs kids are single parent households, and
Mm-hmm.
that's triply, if that's the right word, three times exhausting. So for some of the parents, it's a relief, and they go like this. Yes, there's tears sometimes with any diagnosis, but they say, "Oh my goodness, I wasn't a failure that I thought I was as a parent. I wasn't that failure because I didn't know.
You
I
thought it
didn't
was
know
them.
what I didn't know." Back to the questions that were asked, I didn't know how to communicate. I didn't know what they were trying to say. I just knew that I was throwing my hands up in the air, doing what parents shouldn't do. What? Getting emotional, screaming, yelling, frustrated,
Tried it all.
tried it
Spanking,
all, spent
taking
nothing
away
worked.
Xbox, everything. Yeah.
Come on, come on, come on. You got to stop with the only eating three different things. You have to stop with the not wanting to socialize with the other kids. So for some parents, it's a mixture. Some of relief, not feeling like a failure, finally getting an answer. Over the sessions after they adjust, then I do my thing because I'm an attorney also about, hey, now let's see what we're entitled to. Let's see what the school has to give us. They might have to give us some programming. And not to knock the schools, but they don't always pick up on it. That's why I said parents should persist.
But I want to be real quick to jump on that out of respect to, and I know you don't mean any respect to educators. Our school system, our mental health system, our law enforcement system, first responders, everybody is understaffed and overwhelmed,
Including the schools, of
including the
course. And
schools
it's
that I'm
not so
saying.
much the teachers. I know your wife's a
Yeah,
teacher.
but I mean, there's just like four. I remember there was only four guidance counselors in middle school for all those kids.
Oh, yeah. And then you throw COVID in the mix, and I
Yeah,
wonder how many kids didn't get diagnosed in the past year and a half, right?
right. Yeah.
And then there's funding issues. I don't know what it costs. I have no idea. I don't work for the school board or school district to know what does it cost
Well, even if it
to
doesn't cost
educate.
money, it's time.
It's
I got to call
time.
the parents. We have to have a meeting. We have to speak to their teachers. We have to put an IEP together. We have to integrate the IEP, which I'm sure can be a
Right.
challenging change, especially if they have autism. Especially if it's mid-year, you
So,
have to jump right into it.
oh yeah, now run through the whole fantasy. And now you're a single parent mom, right?
You're
With
working
three kids,
50, 60 hours
50,
a week.
60 out in this economy with three kids. And dad is not like you were a young dad, a single parent dad with your firstborn. Not like you, not so involved. Everything's on mom. Where's she going to have the time to do all this? That's why I said sometimes it's a relief to get that diagnosis and it turns around something in their head that they didn't fail. But if they see it, here's the best way I can answer your question. If they see it as a limit on the possibilities of their life, that's going to cause pain. And I don't think it's limiting whatsoever. Not at all. And like I said, even in the relationships in young adulthood, then that partner's not for them. If you want a certain kind of person, it's not for them. It's like when they do the online dating and they say, should I lie about this or that? I say, well, listen, if you don't like to work out all the time, it won't be a good strategy to lie and say you do
Oh
because you
yeah,
need somebody who's not as focused on that, right?
yeah.
If
Yeah.
they say, they love the arts and movies and you don't and you lie about it, that's going to be a bad strategy. So it's the same thing. It's just about finding the right match and right combination. But you're right, they're difficult sessions. No, I'm sure that when a medical doctor has to give a diagnosis, it's a difficult session too. Psychiatry is no different. Psychology is no different.
But that's part of the discipline of the trade, isn't it? Being able to have the tough conversations.
It is.
Like,
Yes.
I always I'm going to use the word admire a and this probably goes missed a lot of the time or gets unchecked or under the radar, whatever. A doctor who specializes in cancer day in and day out has to say you have cancer. That's a special type of discipline or professionalism. I there was an issue today at the hotel where we weren't sure if the person was okay or well, and I started like, "Oh man, I'm not ready for what's on the other side of the door." So if you're a doctor who's able to say these types of things day in and day out, that's a special kind of discipline, I think, a
I-
unique one.
Very unique. And the thing you don't want to do is make it be rote and routine and lose your sensitivity.
Mm, yeah.
So, and not to sound immodest, I have always had a very busy practice. And sometimes the staff who works for me, if they didn't get back to somebody or not necessarily a kid with autism, they say, "What are you worried about? Why do you worry about that new patient? There's 10 more waiting." And I say, "Oh no. On the day that I say, don't worry about that new patient, there's 10 more waiting, that needs to be the day I step down and don't do this."
Mhm.
So yes, I think for that oncologist, for myself, you really go back and have it like it's the first time you're telling somebody that diagnosis. But I'm very positive, and I don't think, as I said, I don't think any diagnosis is limiting.
But you're also
I
very Jewish. I heard you start a phone session today and somebody said, "I'm well, how are you?" And you listed one problem. So you're very Jewish and that it's not a bad thing
it's a culture.
for the doctor to be honest, it's a cultural thing.
It's definitely a cultural thing.
There's an episode on Curb Your Enthusiasm. Oh, what's his name?
I haven't watched that yet.
Oh, wait, what's his name? Richard Lewis. And somebody always points out how Jewish he is because he anytime he shows up and they're like, "Oh, Richard, you're late." And he's like, "I got my aunt with the thing, you know," and it just starts going down the list, and list. And somebody in the comments was like, "I'm Jewish," and he is so Jewish. You have to flip your little problem in there real quick.
So that's my son making fun of my ethnicity. But what my son doesn't know, and anybody listening can look up, I have a family therapist named Monica McGoldrick, who was wonderful and did a lot of research on ethnicity. And she nailed it because she would say what Ryan's saying about the Jewish culture, about the Indian culture, Hispanic culture, uh, Italian culture, and her book was wonderful. But she also said that one of the best ethnicities to come from being a therapist was being Jewish because we open people up to
Oh,
be
yeah,
able
yeah.
to say,
The
right?
same thing, probably Greek too, and
And to
Italian,
be
yeah.
the warmth and Italian and to be able to
Yeah.
say, "Hey, it's not a great day today, but maybe tomorrow will be." Not be inhibited to be able to explain and open things up. But that's my son. He likes to bust on the culture breaker. He does the thing on how Jewish women part. That could be another episode because he's always
I get anxiety when her or my aunt pulls up. I'm standing at the door and I'm already ready yelling at them, telling them to park differently or I'll park the car because they're halfway out into the street.
hey, eye hand coordination is not necessarily our thing. But here's my answer to that. Nobody can be good at everything, right?
No, I
And
agree.
and maybe that's the motto for everything we're talking about tonight, right?
Yeah,
So maybe some of the communication's a little off, maybe some delays, maybe not so polished socially, but what a wealth. Once you take somebody on the spectrum and you find that safe, you create that safe environment for them and they start to open up, it's one of the most wonderful, magical feelings in the world.
yeah.
Really, I think, because now there's such a wealth of feeling and things, and if you can teach them to open it up, it's a wonderful thing.
I agree. I agree. And I am actually glad that we ran out of time last week because think that this I think that I and perhaps you feel the same way or don't. ADD and ADHD go hand in hand. Autism is its own topic, and we were able to give it its time and attention tonight. So as we approach the end, final thoughts for somebody who may have just been recently diagnosed with autism and their loved ones. So we're gonna turn off the analytical side of everything and the diagnosis and all that, and we're gonna get down to the human side. So somebody just found out they're diagnosed with autism and their parents have as well. What are we saying to
We're saying that the sky's still the limit.
them? Mhm.
It doesn't necessarily change where you'll end up, and find out what works. Don't be focused on what doesn't work. Remember that woman that I said? If she's complaining about that gift, she's probably not the right partner. She's focused on what doesn't work. Figure out what works well. Figure out, like Marla was asking, figure out what's a good way to communicate. What's a good place to pull from some friends. Stay with what works. Steer away from what doesn't work. And don't make yourself in comparison to everybody else. That's never a good strategy. Compete against yourself. Push against yourself. Take some challenges for yourself. Make sure that you don't. Here's a whole nother topic in special needs kids. For the parents, it's a slippery slope to not overprotect. So, do I send my kid to some social event where I know they might not be accepted? But then I say, well, how do you get good at something? Practice. You got to keep doing it. You got to let the kid go. So I think it's a little harder to push the child into independence. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
To not overprotect.
yeah.
So I would say that we work very hard to say it's okay. It's okay to have that tendency to want to overprotect, but we have to deal with the parents anxiety too. It's a cruel world, and sometimes it's a judgmental world, and that's for all kids, right? And so let's not hold
Everybody.
for everybody. So let's not hold them back. Let's give it a little push. Let's deal with the parents' own anxiety and not have that overprotective tendency and dominate the relationship.
And one thing I think is important for anybody, I think everybody should have somebody or something fictional or nonfiction or whatever to look up to. Would you agree that if parents and somebody who just found out they are diagnosed with autism go on Google and you may be pleasantly surprised to see how many successful people are on the
Oh
spectrum?
yeah. Which is why I was flipping out when I heard Bill and Melinda Gates were getting separated because he was my go-to because he definitely seems to me like he's on the
He
spectrum,
definitely
right?
would seem he's on
And
the
and they
spectrum, yeah.
seemed like they had a wonderful marriage, and I was like, "Are you kidding me? Now I got to come up with a whole nother
Elon Musk, I
example."
think maybe.
Okay,
From what I think Elon
I'll
Musk,
go back.
yeah.
And now all these sleazy things about Bill Gates, I'm like, "Oh my, that's gonna force me to look for another example." But yes, I think it's great for them to have some people to look up to and say, "Yeah, they can do it."
One more from Marla. I think this is a good one, actually. Besides therapy, what resources are available? Groups, organizations, books that parents can look into for their children or even themselves?
There are, and that's a great question.
Yeah,
In
definitely.
Bucks County, where I practice, is a group called CHAD, and I don't know because everything's different since the virus and the pandemic, but the CHAD has a parent support group, which I think is a wonderful organization to look into. They're online. I think to go back to your school and ask for some groups. There's a couple socialization groups. There's a program called Tips in Bucks County that works specifically on that socialization. Just things that are difficult. The kids with ADD and ADHD and autism, they don't like to order. They don't want to go to Chick-fil-A and put their order in.
Yeah,
They don't like to do that.
right.
So this tips program will take them out and work on those kinds of things to make them more
That's
independent.
cool.
So Chad, tips, and asking the school for resources and support groups. The nice thing about the tips program is they pair you with a young counselor who's one on one, who takes you out in these, what for a lot of kids are not difficult social situations, but for kids on the spectrum that are a little tougher social situations. And that one on one works really well because they're usually not big group people. So, yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, I think
And
it is
I
too.
hope people look up Chad, and I hope they look up the tips program.
No,
They're both in Bucks County.
I think that's great also. Sounds like two great programs. So All right, so that's gonna bring us to the end of this episode with Dr. Mom, and we don't have a return date set right this moment, but we will get it back to everybody shortly. We have the holiday coming up, so enjoy Memorial Day. And as always, you can reach out to us on the Oppenheimer Project's Facebook page. The link is available there to view everything on the YouTube channel. And if you message us on the Oppenheimer Project's Facebook page, I'll get the message and I can relay it to my mom, and she'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have, I think.
And when we come back, the next uh, thing that we're going to tackle, and this was the background for it, is what's your communication style. So I hope I inspired everybody tonight to think about what's their personal communication style. We talked a lot about if you have ASD, what's your style, but I'm going to challenge everybody to really think what's their style. We tend to want to talk about our partner's style, other people's style that annoys us. Let's not do that. Let's talk next time and meet and talk about what's your communication style.
I like that. So we'll be back with communication style next time we see everybody. Communication style, right? I'm
Yes.
saying right? Okay. All right, everybody. Have a great rest of the week. Enjoy the holiday. We will see everybody next time.